beautifully. And thank you, Ananke Mag, for giving so many women in literature the opportunity to come together and talk. This session is being hosted by the Aleph Review. I'm the publisher and editor-in-chief of the journal, which comes out once a year, and it's celebrating its 5th anniversary now. And it's also a journal which welcomes all forms of writing. I am also a poet, so poetry is a very important part of the Aleph Review. And first off, I would like to introduce all the poets in this session. Firstly, Aisha Rais. Aisha Rais identifies herself as a hybrid, creating hybrid poetry through hybrid forms. That's intriguing. Rais currently serves as an assistant poetry editor at Asian American Writers Workshop, The Margins, and has received fellowships from AAWW, Brooklyn Poets, and Kundiman. Rais's first book of poetry, Coining the Wishing Tower, won the Broken River Prize, hosted by Platypus Press and judged by Kaveh Akbar, and will be out in March 2022. Akbar describes her book as everything I hope to find when I read a book of poetry. Fearless reckoning with unprecedented experience, spoken in a singular, deeply and importantly strange lyric voice. Rais's video poem, The Memoir, was the winner of the Diana Tully Multimedia Contest hosted by Slippery Elm at the University of Findlay, and has been selected for national and international film festivals, including the Midwest Video Poetry Fest and 9th International Video Poetry Festival in Athens, Greece. She is from Lahore, Pakistan, and she is a graduate of Bennington College and currently splits her time between New York City and Lahore. The second person on our team is Aisha Hamid, who is a feminist writer and poet based in Lahore, Pakistan. She graduated from the University of Warwick with an MA in Gender and International Development and is a Commonwealth scholar. Her academic and creative writing both revolve around Pakistani women's agency and the multiple meanings it comes to hold for them. As a woman living and writing in a deeply patriarchal space, she regards her writing as activism. She was among 6 writers shortlisted for the Zinat Haroon Rashid Writing Prize for Women 2019. She was also among 8 writers selected for the Residential LUMS, Young Writers Workshop 2019. She has been published by Whalum and Rare Swan Press. Her poetry is forthcoming in the Aleph Review in 2021, which is on Monday, I think. Afshar Shafi lives in Lahore and has studied English Literature and International Relations at the University of Buckingham and Webster Graduate School, London. Her poems have appeared in Poetry, Poetry Wales, 3am magazines, and others. Her poems have also appeared in anthologies Smear, edited by Greta Bella Messina, the New River Press Yearbook, and Halal If You Hear Me, edited by Fatma Asghar and Salima Elhilo. She has also served as a poetry editor for the Missing Slate and is currently with us, the Aleph Review, as senior contributing editor. She is currently a marketing assistant for the charity Bunyad Foundation, a contributing writer at Libas Now, and is trying to write her first novel. Ilona Yusuf, in her own words, I write poetry not enough as I run a design studio and work as the associate editor of the Aleph Review. As a poet writing in English, I've written about others doing the same to document a genre which doesn't receive as much praise as prose. I have one book of poems, Picture This, and poems scattered in various literary journals locally and abroad. You can find my editorial musings at thealephreview.com and my design work on Instagram at alona.yusuf. So that it is. Now, can I see the panelists? Okay. Now, I want to ask each one of them, how do you think the poetic form has mutated over the last few years? And we can start with Aisha Rais.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mavish, for the lovely introduction and also having me on this panel. I do believe the poetic form is constantly revolving to more contemporary dialogue that is happening in the landscape, even compared to like 5 years ago. Issues of feminism or transgender identity and all of those issues, thanks to the internet, that are becoming more and more accessible to talk about, weren't really something that we were like discussing or interrogating um, in a more like poetic sense. Almost of the poetry that was coming through was on a more conventional side. It is becoming more and more lyrical in that way as well. So the political aspects of what is happening around us is coming through the more of a personal lens. That's a big change I've been seeing in the more contemporary poetry that is coming for now. In more of like sense of form, as in form and not context, I think there is like a lot of hybridity happening, and I will, because I do a lot of hybrid poetry work as well, so it's definitely also a dialogue between not sticking to the formality of what a sonnet would be or what a sestina would be, because these forms are coming from a very stingy idea of Western dialogue, and more Eastern adaptation are taking place, even though sometimes they're anglicized and adapted. But more and more, a lot of
A lot
poets
of
now
poets now
are being
are being
open.
open.
Uh,
Uh,
okay, sorry. Yeah, I had heard like echo. Sorry. So more and more poets are, I think, delving into the in between of form and experimenting in that kind of way. Where in contrast to even like more institutional uh, ideas of craft, which is more conventional ideas of like form. That's, I think that is a really big change I've been seeing. Mavish, you're muted.
So I will now ask Aisha Hamid to answer the same question, which is basically, how do you think the poetic form has mutated over the last few decades?
Thank you for having
Thank you
me.
for
Yeah, this echo. Thank you for having me in the space. Just a disclaimer before I say anything. I do not have a degree in literature or writing as such. So whatever I say here, I'm saying from my observation and from my experience of being in the field of writing since the past 2 years only. Um, so I do think, like Aisha Reis mentioned, that poetry has undergone changes and it has become more democratic. The barriers between the reader and the writer, they have broken down, and poetry has become readily accessible. And it is not just because of social media, but because the form and the diction and the style has changed. And this movement of poetry that began, on the forefronts of which were brown and black women writers like Nayara Waheed and Yersa Daily Ward and Warsan Shire and Rupika, whatever your opinion of their writing is irrelevant to the discussion. But the point is that they inspired a tremendous interest in poetry, and Insta poets sprang up, and readers could read and understand bite-sized poetry in few moments of scrolling down through their phones. And this is something easy to do to maintain that connection. And Pakistani writers coming up and writing in a way as if their pain was already known to the readers, as if their identities were a given or already assumed. So they began writing from a position of power from the point of, yes, I'm a South Asian, Pakistani female, Muslim middle class writer, and this is my experience of womanhood in Pakistan. Take it or leave it. And despite that danger of writing in cliches and generalizations on Instagram, to be instantly relatable, these female writers, particularly Pakistani writers, their voice is authentic and it comes from deeply personal and specific experiences of womanhood. And they use unique images and they still end up being relatable because their voice resonates with so many South Asians around them. And again, that isn't something easy to do on a platform like Instagram. And I mention Instagram a lot because the form has changed, because the medium has changed, because the of this particular form as well. So yeah.
Thank you. That was, yeah. I understand how social media has played a part in all this, and I will now ask Afshan. Afshan, what do you think about this whole question?
Yeah, well, I really agree with what Aisha actually just said, because I think that the biggest change that the form has seen has actually been on Instagram. And in a way, it's really popularized poetry. I mean, I don't think there's really anyone now who doesn't follow some Instagram poet or the other. So it's made the form more accessible, but it perhaps may have also kind of made the world is kind of perhaps relegated their world to very kind of exclusive kind of a world which people might feel a bit intimidated by, because the language there is, more innovative, more experimental, more difficult. So it's been very interesting to see how kind of you have the divergent fans of both kinds of worlds. But I would say that especially with modern poets like Vani Capilio and K. Ryan and Sarah Howe, there's been like a lot of innovation in form, especially amongst female poetry. So it's moved away from the I to the world at large as well. So we're dealing with big, political themes and all of that. So yeah, I do think it's very interesting to see how it will develop over the next decade.
Yeah, I do. I also feel that maybe it has shifted from the I to bigger themes. Now I'll ask Ilona, but Ilona comes from the same period generation of poetry writing as I do, and I know that at that era, there was there is a different kind of we wrote in a different way, and I just like to hear Ilona's take on that.
Okay. So I think what all you young poets said, very, very interesting. And as Mehvish said, we come from a different generation. What I really like is the way there's a lot of different forms appearing. And I think that part of that has to do with the evolution of the internet around the turn of the century, and which made a lot of poetry all over the world very, very accessible to young poets, and which I didn't have, for instance, when I was writing when I was young. And I think that you have much more of it, and it's enabled you to have a lot more diverse experience. As far as differing forms are concerned, I feel that there are different rhythms that now which are being experimented with. I read some of Warsan Shah's work and I really like it. If I look at, let's say, Pakistani diaspora poets, I think there is a return to traditional form, whether written in a very traditional way or kind of using it as a departure point. So from that, I'll use the reference of Shadab Zist Hashmi, who uses the ghazal and the qasida and a lot of historical references and so on. But she's not the only one. There are other poets who are, again, experimenting with traditional form, but in a much more informal way.
So do you think also, Ilona, that I find that there's much more of Urdu writing incorporated in English poetry now, whereas at the time that we were writing, it was more pure English, purist, let's say. And now I find there's a kind of amalgamation of like different languages and especially Urdu. Do you find that as
I do. I mean, I found that like when I first started editing for Al Hamra, then there were some very young poets who were already experimenting with, well, let's say take Hema Raza, or I remember there was a poem by a person called Mahim Maher. And I think she's currently a journalist, but at that time, she'd written a poem which kind of like it had the English and the Urdu side by side. The Urdu was written in Roman, but it was a mixture. So this experimentation actually started within the early 2000s, or maybe it was there before and I didn't see it, but I did see it around that time.
But I see it more now. I mean, as we accept poetry for the Aleph review, I see it more now. Anyway, the next question that I want to ask is, And I presume for most of you, it's an important question. What influence, if any, now it may or it may not, has the oeuvre of modernist Western female poets had on your work? And tell me about the single woman poet. Now you have to tell me one, okay, if it does have an influence, who has influenced your work the most. Okay, so I'll start again from Aisha Reis.
Yeah, as somebody who came into poetry in the West, I was in my undergraduate in Bennington where I fell into poetry. So most of my education and craft, like the way I talk, is from that angle. So it's actually really interesting to hear more from like homeland kind of point of view. I do believe like most of my influences at this point, which I would love to change in the future. But currently my influences are pretty Western women, but they are always not white. They're mostly like the diaspora or from the Asian American or Asian kind of background. And one of my biggest influences currently is this poet named Diana Coy Nguyen. She is Vietnamese American, and she wrote this book called Ghost Off. And it's these series of poems that talk about a loss of her younger brother. So they're all elegies, but they have a mixture of like images and experimenting with language and really like experimenting and balancing what loss is, but in a more larger landscape of where in the American landscape, if you are a person of color and Asian or Pakistani, you're not really looked as, like a just a personal identity. You're also a big political identity. For example, I won't be Aisha, I would be a brown Pakistani Muslim, all of that. And that would be seen first. And a lot of times I won't be afforded to be known as Aisha at all. So she talks about the balance on care about and fighting against those boundaries, as well as what the consequences of always being looked as an political identity, just like that. And I think that's why in a lot of ways, both in Pakistan as well in the Western landscape, poetry can break that barrier. It can bring the personal into all the political stuff that's happening, but it will always remain political. So even the I means like the I, but it can be also generalized political stance, right? So it's really interesting, and she is definitely one of my biggest inspiration because I try to also care a lot in my own work that I want to balance, like I want to be seen as me, but also I don't want to just defy all the reality that is happening around me.
That's really interesting, and I'd love to read her work. And what about Aisha Hamid? One single person, and if you are influenced by women in the Western world.
I don't think that I can name a single woman poet.
Okay.
Just my work
You'll have to
so.
name one though. You'll have to name one out of all the ones that you think you're influenced by. Just name one, because otherwise we can go on forever.
I think that my voice is made of all the echoes. Sorry. So my voice is made from all the voices of the poets that I've read. There's an echo still. I'm so sorry.
No, but I've muted.
So yeah, my voice is made up from the voices of all the female poets that I've read, and I've mostly read people of color, women of color, and non-binary folks. So if I had to name one, I would say Fatma Asghar, because her poetry collection, if they come for us, that she experiments a lot with form in her poetry. It opened up a lot of possibilities for me as a writer, and from that, I was able to write poetry in the form of an email, in the form of a film script. And other than that, I have so many other influences. I genuinely cannot name just one, because all of these female poets, they're very strong voice poets. And because reading is such a political act, it definitely matters in what you read, and because it impacts your voice and it impacts your worldview. And if your voice is impacted by the writers that you read, then it means that you're growing as a writer and you're writing in new and meaningful and valuable and powerful ways. So I would credit all of these female writers that I've read, and I would definitely take the moment to mention the Pakistani female writers that are coming up, Aruja Zafar, Yusra Amjad, Sadia Khatri, all of their voices are very authentic and credible. And because they're redefining what it means to be a woman in Pakistan, particularly, and it takes a lot of courage to make your writing so accessible to thousands of people, and then to write about themes like sexuality and violence and abuse, and again, whatever your opinion of Insta poetry is, it doesn't matter. But whatever is happening there is pretty revolutionary. So I think I've drawn courage from these writers.
Okay.
And
So you haven't mentioned a Western author, you or poet. You've mentioned some Pakistanis. So Afshan, what about you?
Pakistan is a diaspora.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So Afshan, what about you, Sylvia Plath?
Yeah, well, I always say, I always kind of do credit Sylvia Plath in like every interview, whatever. But I think that, yeah, I agree with Aisha Reis in this aspect, that I love the way that she actually did make the personal public in a way. And she still kept her privacy, but she still spoke about what was very, close to her. But I would like to say that I do feel like Plath's myth has become kind of glamorized, and actually the true quality of her work is sometimes, hidden under all of the, news clippings or whatever. I think that her eye for detail and her craft is really what has always appealed to me. So yeah, I think that would be my only answer.
Very brave of you to sort of demystify her a bit, Afshan. In the sense that, I mean, de-glamorize her a bit. I think that's brave. So now I want to ask Ilona the same question.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So Ilona, what about you?
You want me to name one Western poet that has influenced me, right? So as I said, as we both said, we come from a different generation. I don't have one poet, but if I could say, if I could say something that really influenced the way I work with words, which is like extreme compression, that would be Emily Dickinson. That's it in a nutshell. But there's lots of other people.
Okay, now, guys, I want to know. Well, I'll ask this third question that I wanted to ask last, because I want to also hear a short poem by all of you. But I want to also ask about the space. So I feel that, like, when we were, again, Ilona, you and I, when we were writing and when we were looking towards the older poets that we were looking up to, there was a kind of sense of space, of country, but that was very much like connecting to your immediate space, and people like Tawfiq Rafat and Kaleem Umar and Maki Qureshi and all of them were trying to divorce us writers or younger writers from using the English metaphors, English whatever, or American or whatever, and finding your own idiom, right? Now I think that might have changed because of the fact that poetry is now, it's a global thing. These young people are writing globally. They're in touch with Instagram, and within minutes, I mean, what you write is shoots across continents and things. So is the sense of space as important now as it was in our days? I want to ask Aisha Reis if Pakistan is visible in your poetry as it was in ours, or is feminism or any other factor the stronger influence? Aisha Reis.
Honestly, thank you so much for that question, and really well curated as well. I left Pakistan when I was 18, and honestly, um, I'm still like in the part of my identity where I'm still like always finding new things about myself on a personal political way. It is very strange. I think anyone who has spent even a significant time or like small time abroad in their like younger years feel like they have been influenced in some ways, right? So So in regards to space, I feel like when I think about space, I really think about community. And when I say what I mean about community is like in any country, in any, even if you are a majority, like, you know, we as women, we are minorities in Pakistan. However we look at, we are marginalized in a lot of ways. And I think that was only because we are sharing other majority identities as like brown, like looking the same, speaking the same, the language, linguistics, and all of that in some ways too. And assuming that majority is Sunni too. So there are like things that we take privilege from, but then there are aspects that we take, you know, we are marginalized in, and in that, in Pakistan especially, as well in the global landscape, womanhood is one of those aspects, and that does tie us together. I think anything that is makes us kind of like othered or marginalized in any way, the minority in any landscape, when those people, when we come together, we create that community, and then we create that space. So I think space in that way is very important. In like us doing this thing is a space as well. I met you guys, I've seen you, I will be hearing your poems. I think creating space, despite however fast the internet is and however global it becomes and however like, you know, all of the acts there we have access, I think human connection in the end of the day is foundational in any time and space. This is why we are social animals. In the end of the day, we are going to love and care for each other, and we're going to try to find what connects us most of the time instead of like what doesn't. So I definitely think space, creating space is an important thing as any creative, not just poets. And I feel like it's work that's being done in both Pakistan and the global world. And poetry and any creative endeavor, poetry especially, I feel like it's one of those literary things that if you become a poet, you're not gonna like, you know, buy a house of because of book of poetry, right? So it's like one of those endeavors that you really is a labor of love, and the labor, it's a labor of love that is mostly also out of the page is the connection. And I'm also thinking like, you know, like all the mehfils and all the mushairas, wow, look at this, mushairas and everything is like such a generational beautiful thing. And these things actually, these poetry circles are actually found in every historical like countries, like in like the haiku and stuff. It used to be a poetry like circle. That's how it started in Japan and stuff. So now I feel like we are like the poetry readings and the open mics, I think it's just like a more like modern way, like just like another word of the whole circles that are happening. Like in Mashire, we say wah wah wah. In like more like the English settings, it's like we click our fingers. So I think that these actions are also contributing to a poetic space and a poetic community. So I honestly think we should continue having and creating and curating space. And yeah.
Okay, wonderful. That was really an interesting answer. So, Aisha, what about you, the other Aisha? Two Aishas here. Aisha
Um,
Hamid?
so I think that even when I write about feminism in my poetry, which I do a lot, Pakistan is always there. It's always visible. Like I mentioned, my identity as a Pakistani female writer is a given for me. So I start from that position because I'm not writing for the male gaze or the white gaze for that matter. As for how space impacts my writing, I have a different view than I totally agree with what Aisha said, and I have a different view than that because I don't know what it feels like to write in at a park on a bench surrounded by nature. I've never done that. I recently read a poem by a male friend of mine, and he wrote about being at a mechanic, getting his car fixed. And then he wrote about being at a Punjabi theater where a man nearby was masturbating. And I felt a strange kind of loss knowing that I could never write poetry about something like that because I'd be too concerned about my own safety to notice anything around me. So I feel like it's kind of a violence that women cannot write about very basic human experiences being in Pakistan. And but ironically, my poetry ends up being a lot about space and about feminism because of that very reason. But I do feel that the content of my poetry is again vastly different from male writers, for instance, writing in Pakistan. And I feel like when I'm writing, I still have to explain that I am struggling as a woman, that I'm hurt as a woman, and we're still trying to say that we matter too. It was still trying to make people believe us. Because of the political atmosphere of Pakistan, the backlash that Aurat March receives every year, violence against women. So I believe your location, your space does have a lot of impact. And it's no coincidence that the content of my writing and our writing tends to be a lot about practice, being in the house. And but still, Pakistan is always visible because it's what I can't. Sorry, it's because the things that I don't write or cannot write about, I'm writing about them. So yeah.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So your space is mostly it's a feminist space as well in within Pakistan. And
Yes.
what about you, Afsha?
Yeah, I actually really agree with Aisha Hamid here as well. I think that if you are a female poet in Pakistan, I think you are either unconsciously or even automatically kind of aligned with the feminist movement. Because I don't really think that even, I mean, you can belong to any kind of class or structure over here, but even if you like belong to the bourgeoisie, you're not going to be, welcomed with open arms if you're a practicing artist or a poet. I think here people are they are slightly suspicious of kind of any woman writing about her life, or uh, there's a sense of being threatened as well, and so it's quite a challenge to carve out a space for yourself. And but I'm very happy that I think I've seen the evolution of space for female artists in Pakistan. I think it's really becoming bigger. And so yeah, I think we all have like a little small part to play in that, for sure.
Definitely, I think all of you do, all of us, let's say. And what about Ilona? Ilona, again, I mean, I'll say that you come from a different, slightly generation from these young girls. So there was a sense of very much. I feel a sense of space of Pakistan. But what do you feel?
So first of all, I never thought of myself as a feminist. I did write poems about womanhood or about women, and uh, I mean, like, I guess they could be called feminist in nature, or with some, let's say, inclination towards feminism. But I never thought of them that way. And now I think that when one listens to, let's say, what all you young poets are saying, you realize how things have changed, and how much more politically conscious you are as women, whereas in my generation I wasn't, or I might have been to a certain extent, but it wasn't the forefront. Um, so like, and now at this point in time, I just write about the things that really matter to me, and in let's say the last 10 years, they have been to a certain extent political, even though I'm a very apolitical person. But what happens is that events around you take place, so you write about them just automatically.
Okay, now for the final thing, I think we've gone on quite a bit. So for the final bit, I would just like you to describe your poetic voice very shortly, and then read a poem. So we'll start with Aisha. Please.
Thank you. I'm gonna just pull out something. Yeah, so I think my poetic voice is definitely autobiographical, lyrical, image heavy. Um, Sometimes it's like too me, but I think I try to use that as a lens to something else. I'll be reading this a poem called Media, the Greek person media, not media. Okay, Media. I held the night in my throat gulp, entwined my fingers for promise, roped until knotted until true. That is how I turned my held breath into mind scream, rattled each and every atom to uncondition from condition. Inseparably, my limbs still adhere to grounded past, romanticized only because naive. I woke to paralysis, a white statue on top of me, my room full with the headless crowd, I was not alone until I was. Events like these happen, never imagined, never overblown. I call it ailment and no longer a right to God, for no prophet was ever a woman, just a moan rupturing in mothered support. Yes, the modern women are growing apart from need, learning for once to prod our first new. Look, my own dime, my own shelter, my own thirst. But I cannot forego all mothers that have been stabbed, and how often they torture my hands to pull out the needles. Please forgive me. I just want to live in the sky. And this is how guilt parts me into two rivers, misery and joy. Every swim is not a safe from drown, but sharp are the rocks even in erosion. My lungs are laden with debris, encouraging a play of sink, a game of anchor, a mock of fill, won by a force that changes defiance to compliance. I was told anything is possible, even love, but then I became a third world, first world role, becoming undone due to labeled breast and skin.
Thank you so much. That was really lovely. Thank you. And Aisha number 2 now.
I would describe my poetic voice as feminist, no surprise, and agentic and unapologetic and emotive and also autobiographical. And feminist in the sense that I attempt to allow peek into the lived realities of women and the many different ways that women live their lives, and to say that this is a valid way of living as well. As for the poem, let me pull something out as well. Um, so this is a very short poem. It's called Smallness. My cats know my house better than I do. How have they not gone mad, sniffing my dead body, sniffing the skeleton of this house, never crossing its threshold? Their house is without lightness, without airiness. To breathe, I smashed living room's window without a view of concrete and another window. No one told me this house was built on graveyards of women who fried their tongues on pans. I would have planted a dozen trees, sprinkled rose water, and chanted, take up space, take up space, take up space. Thank you.
That was lovely too. Really nice. And I will now ask Afsha to do the same.
Yeah, well, I would just describe my poetic voice as being obsessed with language. So I'm definitely more fond of the obscure terminology and kind of, experimenting with language. But the poem I'm reading today is Quiet Women. So it's the titular poem of my recent collection. So yeah, I'm going to start. Didn't start out quiet until drawn out of my own body to scarf it cell by cell, last meal. Mirrors fell around me, melding into a single tunnel. Everywhere I looked, a spark petal loosened into tremulous flesh. The star guzzling reek of burnt petal clasped my throat. Looked down at feet that belonged to another. People who danced over ice hills, warlocks. Like them, I was not forgiven. Greedy for all the glowing refuse, greedy for the shimmering stranger, tear-burned ghosts, greedy for the prolonged street dweller, morning throat, heart skidding on dirty snowflakes. A false start, waking up in a crate of gold snakes. False hope, a masquerade of high heaven, because the escape had to have precious ships on call. There was nothing there. Lion, water, water, lion. Held my own face in front of me and counted teeth. Dear illusionist, your magic was bloodshot. Thank you.
Very nice. And I've always noticed that you do kind of experiment a lot with words, and that excites you. So now finally, Ilona, your poetic voice and a poem, a short poem.
So I think extreme compression and as few words as possible and as simple words as possible. I guess that's it in a nutshell. So this is a very short poem. It could be about women. It's called Word. Word. It stands alone. Spoken, it's like a soft breeze ruffling the fine hairs at the nape of your neck, that elongates itself, twisting to translate into nuances of meaning, symbols for life. Freedom, hard-won prize.
Beautiful. You have very kind of deft and simple strokes in your poetry, I've noticed. Anyway, what I want to just end by saying is that all of us are affiliated with the Aleph Review in some way. Ilona, you are the associate editor. Afshan is senior contributing editor. These two girls have contributed to our on the website as well as for the print magazine, and it's been very nice because it feels like we're talking about space. It feels like a space for the Aleph Review. Although, I mean, I haven't met both the Aishas before, but still it feels, because of that, a space for the Aleph Review. And all the best to you all for the future. Thank you.